You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Carrie Wong. I'm an assistant professor here at the IOE. In this season of Research for the Real World, we're covering children, families, and the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic was unprecedented, and no matter how many articles compared it to the Spanish flu, the collective challenges made our world small again. However, when it comes to challenges, none has been more difficult right now than how children and families have handled the pandemic. So in this episode, I'm delighted to be talking to Professor Almudena Sevilla. Almudena Sevilla is a professor in economics and public policy at UCL and co-director of the Center for Time Use Research at the UCL Institute of Education. She has also held positions at Queen Mary University, University of Oxford, University of Essex, Institute for Social and Economic Research, and the Congressional Budget Office in Washington, D.C. She received her PhD from Brown University in 2004 in the fields of family and population economics and econometrics. Almudena is an applied microeconomist whose research focuses on the areas of gender, child development, and human capital. She teaches in these areas at the graduate and undergraduate level. Almudena's current project, a very exciting one which we'll hear more about in a second, is Parent Time. It is funded by a €2 million European Research Council Consolidator grant. It aims to develop new socioeconomic theories to understand the underlying mechanisms driving intergenerational transmission of inequality. For example, high socioeconomic status parents consistently produce high socioeconomic status children. The question is how? So we will hear more about this project in just a second from Almudena. But first, welcome and hello, Almudena. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Carrie. Nice to be here with you all. Thank you for having me here today.
Great. It's lovely to have you here today, too. And just to start off with a kind of easy question as well, so our listener gets to know you a bit more. How did you become involved in education? And what was your journey like?
Well, I was trying to think about that question precisely, trying to advise my daughters as to what careers to follow. I always thought it was sort of a random process. But when I deepened a little bit more into the question, I realized that I've always been very hungry for knowledge, and I've always wanted to know more about everything. And I think this is really what's driven me to research and to pursue this academic career. I just love learning more about things and human behavior, really, as a social scientist.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. And I'm sure maybe your daughter is also like you, hungry and eager to learn new things as well. Can you tell me a little bit more about what a microeconomist is and how does that work apply to child development specifically?
Well, economics is a social science, so we're ultimately interested in human behavior and what drives behavior in people and how policy can affect that behavior. So in my research, I'm interested in what drives parental investments in children and how can we help parents get the most out of their children in terms of happiness, but also in terms of school outcomes, in terms of other well-being outcomes.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like, when you talk about investment or thinking about children as an investment, some of the constructs that you just mentioned, like well-being or, along those lines, those things are quite difficult to measure, aren't they? How do you do that as a microeconomist?
So draw on multiple data sources from big surveys of data where we try to get information on well-being directly from children, from their parents, from their teachers. I've also been working with administrative data and linking those registers that have lots of information about children, including medical records, to their and then we link that to surveys that we run on those children. So we have a lot of information on how children perform at school and also how they behave at school, at home, and around their peers. So I am now co-director of the Center for Time Use Research, and one of the things that we do is collect time diary data, where we actually ask parents and children about their day. So we collect information on the 24 hours, and we know exactly what families are doing and how they interact with one another, and that's really, really interesting.
Mm. So can you just double tap a little bit on that, collecting data 24/7? That, as a psychologist, that's kind of new to me. How do you do that exactly?
Oh, okay. So for example, the latest UK Tamil survey, which was run in 2015, used a pen and paper diary where respondents had to record what they were doing every 10 minutes. And they could do it, after the day was over, because the diary is set up in such a way that it's very, very easy to fill out. With a pen and pencil, you basically scroll down through the hours, and it's quite respondent friendly. What's been really challenging during the pandemic has been to replicate those kind of surveys on computers or mobile devices. And it's been an interesting journey where we have been able to develop a tool that is equally easy to use through the scrolling mechanism in the iPhone or in the computer. And we're right now perfecting that tool, because it's been a real challenge to collect time diary data during COVID. And I think, lots of interesting research has come from that new way of collecting this data.
That's really cool. So as a result of the pandemic, you've had to pivot and your methods have changed, and sounds like you've improved on a method and created something completely better, maybe for the future as well. So I guess maybe my next question is more about the series, really, of the podcast, right? So today, the series, we're interested in the impacts of the pandemic on families. What would you argue are the kind of main factors in terms of inequality that the pandemic has highlighted in society that we're seeing now?
Yes, there has been two main strands that I have investigated during the pandemic. One is related to child development and the sort of issues that we were just talking about, and the fact that the pandemic has widened the existing inequalities in children's education. So we know being off school, being at home learning, has negatively affected children from lower economic backgrounds, much more so than children from higher economic backgrounds. And our research has shown that has been driven by different factors. One is resources at school. The other one is resources at home. It's not just material resources in terms of computing access and internet access, but also parental resources, because parents from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have found it more challenging to spend time with their kids when they needed it most. That is one aspect of inequalities that I have studied. And the other aspect, which I think the pandemic has actually brought back to the fore, is gender inequalities and what has happened when workers and people have been locked down at home trying to get some work done. And so one of the things that my research has shown, and that you couldn't find this with other traditional surveys, so this is where the time diary surveys come really handy, is that not only women were spending more time in housework and childcare, but their work hours were much more interrupted by other activities. So by being able to observe the whole sequence of a person's daily life, you actually see those interruptions so much more than what you see, that what you would otherwise observe if you were to ask how much time you spend doing this or that, right? And that is really important, because interrupting someone when they need a chunk of time to really get into a task, it can be really counterproductive and really affect their productivity. And that has a direct link with wages and career progression. So, yeah, women have been particularly affected by the pandemic.
And maybe just maybe I have a personal questions just on that too. Does your data look at different industries as well, or are some industries better than others? And are there kind of age differences also in women? Obviously, women with maybe younger children, they're more affected, or do you see those kind of trends in your data set at all?
One of the things that we've studied with US data, actually, where schools were closed for longer periods of time, and there was also a lot of variation across states, because that's really what you need in order to make any sort of causal inference and that has any policy relevance. You really need to understand to what extent that the correlations that you find are actually directly causal, so that then you can say, look, this thing is causing this other thing and we need to take action, right? So to what extent have schools closures have affected labor force participation? This is a question that we studied using labor force surveys in the US. And what we found is that it affected particularly parents with young children. It didn't affect so much parents with older children. So you see a clear divide there. So it is about childcare. And the other thing that we observed, and that has come in my research in the UK as well, and has been reported for other countries, is again that it is women the ones that take most of the burden. And whereas men's, the extent to which men reduce the hours of work or stop being employed depends to a great extent on the help they have at home. Women will, will work at home and will take care of the children, no matter what their work is, or no matter, whether their partner works at home or not. So that is something that has also come out of the data. To some extent, people with flexible works can actually face those challenges a little bit better, so their employment hours haven't been reduced as much, but we still observe quite big impacts of school closures, reducing like hours of work by about 15%, which is quite significant.
Yeah, that's really significant. So then I wondered, with with your data set, do you have also, when schools reopen again, have things been, returned back to normal, so to speak? Or is it that actually women continue to be the ones who are working around the clock?
I think that that's one of the interesting questions for future research. I think it's still early days, and we're trying to find a balance. And I think researchers are divided as to how the pandemic will affect the future division of labor, how men and women organize themselves at home and at work. And I think it's we still need a little bit more time to gather data to be able to say something meaningful there. In my opinion, based on the research that I've done and based on other experiences that we've had, is that this time is a little bit more. It's a little bit different, because I think people's attitudes have changed regarding the way we work. So, for example, women have always worked from home to greater numbers or to a greater extent than men, but working from home wasn't understood in the same way that it is understood now. So the challenges from working from home were generally overlooked. They were so working from home was seen as a luxury, and as kind of time off to be able to maybe not work. And I think what people have understood now is that working from home is not necessarily easier than going to the office, right? So yeah, there was a director at the back of England saying, talking today about the dangers of women staying at home in this virtual environment and losing out. And this is an old debate in the literature, because exactly women working from home and taking greater flexibility, the side effect of that is that they lose out on informal networks and career opportunities, right? And that it's a double-edged sword. But I think what's different now is that people understand the challenges of working from home. And so both women that decide to stay at home after the pandemic are aware of those challenges and can take action, but also men that may decide to go to the office at greater numbers understand what their wives go through when they stay at home.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I guess, I mean, lot of what we spoke about is in relation to your project as well, Parent Time. Can you concretely describe to our listeners a little bit more about the key aims of Parent Time as a project, and also, what you hope to achieve from this project as well?
So this project started off with a big question in the literature, which is the question of income inequality, and the fact that we still don't understand why we have these persistent inequalities in society when we spend so much money as a society, and the government puts so much money into educating all children, etc. And so the literature has studied, the parental income as a determinant. So richer parents can put more, can take their kids to private school and offer tutorials, etc. But we haven't had the chance to really look into what parents do with their children with big data sources. So you're a psychologist, so psychologists have been studying this question for quite a long time, but because the sample sizes are generally smaller, it's harder to generalize. So I think what's really new from this project is to take this big data approach and try to look from a numbers kind of perspective what goes on in the family. So a big methodological innovation here is to put together registered data where we have, I was saying before, a lot of information on these children and these parents, and put that together with time diary surveys where we actually ask deeper questions about what these parents and children are doing, so that we can start to understand how those interactions, how the time that parents spend with their children impact their lives, not just during childhood and adulthood, but also later on when they grow up.
And you had the time diaries even pre-pandemic as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we have been collecting these time diaries during the pandemic, and so this particular project I was talking about is that it actually uses Danish data. The northern European countries are very good at keeping track of their citizens. So they have registers where, yeah, they keep records of,
Yeah.
health visits and diagnoses, and apart from employment, education, school grades, etc. And you can link that data to different sort of surveys. And so we have data from the 80s, children that were born in the 80s, and because we can follow those children through the register today, we know, how much time they spent with their parents and whether that had an impact later on in life.
Great. And can you just get a rough sense of the sample size? Because I'm very jealous of the big data that you have.
Okay, so well, I mean, the registers are the whole population of Denmark, which is not very big, but it's still the whole population. Sadly, once you start linking that data to the time diary surveys, then numbers, it's a survey data, so numbers go down a little bit. So I think we have about 1,500.
Yeah, but very rich data as well, and interconnected, linked, triangulating from different sources. So that's fantastic data set. It sounds like that you have. So I guess maybe a little bit, as a researcher who is studying parent time during the pandemic, I wondered, whether this itself has changed the way in which you work as well. As a parent, how's the pandemic affected your own work? And has it informed, new strands of inquiry as well?
Well, I think I am not an exception when it comes to how the pandemic has affected academic work in general. And one of the things that we see is that women in academia have been affected to a much greater extent. So we have not produced as much as we would have if the pandemic hadn't happened. I have been quite productive actually, so maybe I am an exception. It was my way to get out of to look at the pandemic from a scientific angle, sort of like I'm watching a movie, this is not happening to me. So it was quite helpful that way,
Yeah.
but also quite depressing to find out about all this research coming up where men were really flourishing during the pandemic in terms of publications, working paper publications, and women less so. And it was certainly hard to be working during the pandemic.
Yeah, maybe knowing the inequalities and the stats that propelled you into being the exception to bring up the average, maybe a little bit. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, and putting those inequalities in my work as I was doing the work actually helped. It felt like I was also contributing to change, at least to the awareness of those inequalities. So.
Yes, definitely. And on that note as well, so how has your work been, received by those in policymaking, everyone in the media and the press? They must be very much interested in this, in all the findings you've come out with from the project.
Well, yeah. So in terms of gender inequality, it's a topic that is usually very well received. Although the media tends to focus on the negative always to, I guess, to increase attention from their readers and their viewers. And I think there are lots of positive messages coming out as well. So it is okay to highlight the gender inequalities that the pandemic may have widened, but I think it's also important to highlight what are the new opportunities in terms of closing those inequalities that the pandemic has opened up. So some of my articles were covered by The Economist, for example. So it had a lot of media and press attention. The work on children inequalities and what can be done about it also received attention from policymakers in the UK, BBC, etc. This is joint work with the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And we're still working on it because part of that project, so we collected several surveys at different points during the pandemic. And what we ultimately want to do is to see how, what was going on within the family has affected children later on. So the idea is to link those survey data again to the national pupil data set and see how those children fare later on in terms of the school outcomes. But even our survey data showed a lot of granular information as to how children were doing in different backgrounds, with different backgrounds, were doing during the pandemic. And policymakers were really interested in understanding how to help families. One of the things that came out from that research is that we surveyed parents about what they would want, what they would value more: extra classes like mathematics or English, or sports, other extracurriculum activities. And this was something that came very clear from the data. Parents were all for extracurriculum activities that would foster children's socialization within the school. And I think the focus so far had been on online tutoring systems, and which is okay, which is good. We still need to do it. But at the time where we published that finding, there was little talk about the effect on non-cognitive, sort of more social aspects and impacts of the pandemic. on children. So.
Definitely. I think, a lot of the children I work with, they say they miss their friends, and some of them are actually worried about going back to school because, it's they haven't been back for a long time. And I guess, as a psychologist too, I'm wondering a little bit whether mental health features in any of the data that, you've looked at as well. Was this something that parents also, recognized or wanted children to, know more about, or that they wanted some more information on as well, or was this not really featured?
In terms of the understanding what is going on with children was something that parents had to report. So it was parental perception as to whether the children were more depressed, less motivated, jumped up, or reacted more quickly than other times, so less patient. And we definitely see that the pandemic had an effect on those aspects of children's well-being. And so we asked parents, what would you value the most from, what can the government do? And it wasn't necessarily extra classes, but actually, there was a discussion about an extra month or less holidays, or that wasn't what they wanted. They wanted, opportunities to socialize after school and during school.
No break time, no play time. And so I guess, with a project like this, big project like this, oftentimes there are more questions come out after it. And I wondered, what is next for you when this project ends? What are some other new avenues of, research ideas are you going to pursue?
I think I like to put together these two areas of research, which are generally, or at least I've understood them as being separate. The gender inequalities being separate, a different entity from inequalities in childhood. And I think when you look at gender inequalities in the workplace, it all goes back to education, right? And what's happening when boys and girls are growing up. And going back to economists, I don't think we understand as a social science the parental biases and how parents behave differently with children from different genders, and unconsciously or consciously. We understand a little bit more about teachers, but I think that's what I want to do next, to really see whether parents react different to having a boy or having a girl, and how that impacts the trajectories of boys and girls, and how that translates into different labor market outcomes. So bringing the life cycle perspective to gender inequalities, I think it's my next step.
Next big project, it sounds like. Well, that's fantastic, Almudena. It has been really amazing talking to you. I've learned a lot along the way, and a very interesting perspective as well, and a lot of amazing work that you're doing. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Carrie, for having me, and it's been great talking to you too.
You can follow Almudena on Twitter at SEVILLA_ALMU to learn more about her research. Some of what we covered today are also available in the episode notes. If you enjoyed this episode and want to find out more, we've been around the block and have more episodes for you to listen to whilst you walk around yours. Search IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts, and to find episodes from seasons 1 to 11 of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from the IOE. I'm Carrie. See you next time. Research for the Real World is brought to you by the IOE Marketing and Communications team,
in association with IOE Research Development.
This podcast is presented by me, Dr. Carrie Wong,
and me, Dr. Sam Sims.
The theme music was created by Rob Cochran.
Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor.
Amy Leibowitz is the series producer.
And Jason Illigan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.